everybody good? Okay, so congrats y'all. I hope it's fun. So pretty simple case, just like one line model. So the case is this House believes that it would be preferable to the status quo if the US federal government cut half of all military spending and invested it in the State Department instead. Again, this House believes that it would be preferable to the status quo if the US federal government cut half of all military spending and invested it in the State Department instead. The model, just like we don't cut from nuclear, so we like don't decrease our capacity of nuclear weapons or like the people that watch them. And then in terms of like how we invested in the State Department, it's just invested proportionately. So like there's some pie chart of how State Department funding is allocated now. We say that half of military spending should go to that pie chart with the same proportions. Questions?
Cool. So when you say not nuclear spending, does that mean you're cutting half of non-nuclear, or you're cutting half of total, but nuclear is in the half you don't cut?
We wouldn't reduce the money spent on like maintaining like nuclear
so you're
weapons,
cutting-
but we're still cutting half of the overall thing. We're just saying like
Right.
Yeah.
personnel cuts and whatnot would not come out of that area.
Do you
Yeah.
know how big a fraction of the U.S. military budget the military nuclear stuff is?
It's not particularly large.
It's like it's not more than a
Okay.
quarter. Like we're not going to make
Yeah.
specific
Well,
arguments about it.
presumably it doubles, but if it goes from like 1 to 2, that's not a difference. If it goes from like 20 to 40, that would be a difference.
I don't
That's
think
what
that. I don't think
Yeah.
there's reason to believe that it's in
That-
the
that much
20
of
to
a
40
proportion.
range.
Okay.
I think it's like less than. I'm
Okay.
sure it's less than
Yeah.
10.
Okay, that's fine then.
What is the allocation currently in the State Department?
The allocation in the State Department is like
What do we spend money on?
so
What is, like,
we
what-
spend
where
money.
would the money be going to?
Okay, so we spend lots of money on diplomats, spend lots of money on like supporting non-governmental organizations that do work overseas. We spend money on like hosting and setting up international institutions. Like some money is spent on like the salaries of top level officials. It's mostly like the diplomats themselves and the fora in which they do diplomacy.
And then how does the allocation, I guess, geographically is what you meant by continue? So when you said
Yeah.
same allocation that's currently, is that geographically? Is that by program? Is that
By program.
what
yeah,
are the
yeah.
3 biggest programs in the State Department? Right
So like there are huge programs affiliated with the UN, affiliated with international institutions like the WTO or like NATO.
So it's mostly UN and trade stuff that would be that?
Yeah, that's like that's one of the big
Yeah.
programs. Another big programs would be like diplomatic missions. So like going to international institutions that the U.S. isn't a part of. So like visiting international institutions in Asia or like Africa or Latin America. It's mostly like funding these diplomatic missions.
How much of, how big are these 2 budgets in the status quo?
So the current military budget is on the order of like $730 billion. There's a proposed, there's a
With the B?
With a B.
billion with a B. The State Department budget, I want to say, is just below 100 billion.
So it's, call it, you're taking 370, you're roughly quintupling the State Department budget.
Roughly, we would say like closer to 4 times than 5 times, but yeah.
There's 365 moves from one to the other, call it 360, okay.
Yeah.
Um,
Oh, I need your phone.
Oh yeah.
Is this
I'm not throwing it.
Yeah.
is this like in this budget year? Or is this a permanent reallocation for all future budgets?
Like we say it would be preferable to the status quo if it were a permanent reallocation.
Okay.
Like we're not making an argument about like Congress should pass this bill to do
Yeah.
this. It's just like if this was the world, it would be preferable to what we have now.
But also like us saying like if we did this it would be better. It doesn't mean that in every like if in 300 years like humans don't speak
Yeah.
anymore and it's just
Yeah.
like physical warfare that we couldn't adjust our like state policy to
Yeah. We're
like
not-
in a reasonable fashion.
Yeah, we're not trying
We're
to
not
talk
saying this is
about
for
the like
infinity.
millennium time frame. Just trying to talk about like next maybe decades. We're not going to make arguments about decades. You could.
I'm sorry, I'm not American, so I'm a little bit.
For sure.
I remember a Colin Powell quote from a few years back that
Yeah.
was like, the US has the capability to fight 1.5 wars at any given time. Does that still roughly where the
I think
I don't
Colin
think
Powell
that's,
was
like,
lying
right.
at the time. I think under Colin Powell, the U.S. was fighting no fewer than 8 wars.
Yeah,
So
like,
the
we
the
just fight way
so
more wars
so
than that at all moments.
so just like the U.S. has the largest military budget
Yep.
than the next 10 budgets combined. Like we have enough military capacity probably to be at war on every continent. Like I wouldn't say we're at war on every continent currently, but we have troops deployed and like are doing activities with our military everywhere. I would say that like there's not a lot of limits on where the military can go, like as illustrated by current military expansionism.
What do people say about the state of the State Department's budget now? Like, is it like, do people say that it's underfunded, that?
Yes, like
So
so
there's
like
consensus
one
that it's underfunded.
yes. So like the reason why we're doing the case is like I'm a poli-sci major. I read a lot of articles by diplomats and like foreign policy, and there has been a consensus for many decades. It probably at least going back to Reagan, but likely even before that, like at the expense of military spending, the diplomatic corps has been depleted.
I think I'm good.
Okay, then let's start. This House believes that it would be preferable to the status quo if the U.S. federal government cut half of all military spending and invested it in the State Department instead. Our first argument is that increased State Department spending is good. This is because the State Department fosters closer ties between the U.S. and foreign states. The State Department improves U.S. relations with other states via coordination between high-level and staff-level officials, as well as economic diplomacy. We argue that A, the State Department setting up meetings between the U.S. and foreign states, during which high-level officials from all parties can have discussions, improves state-to-state relations. This fosters closer ties between both states because high-level officials become familiar with one another and learn not only their negotiating styles, but also what they view as their core interests of their countries, leading to more open lines of communication, which mitigates the risk of foreign policy crises stemming from miscalculations based on a misunderstanding of the other country's intentions or fundamental interests. The State Department also improves state-to-state relations by B, generating collaboration between staff-level officials in the U.S. and foreign countries. Staff collaboration occurs in the preparation before, work during, and follow-up after bilateral talks as well as meetings of international institutions. Collaboration between staff-level officials strengthens ties between states, not only because staff from each state work together to develop policy, leading each country to see the other's policy as in its interest, but also in that it creates staff-to-staff relationships between counterparts, and that means that they're more likely for policies that they're more likely to advocate for policies that won't lead to the death of their counterparts. Additionally, the State Department bolsters U.S. ties with foreign states via C, economic diplomacy. The State Department primarily promotes economic diplomacy by negotiating trade agreements. Trade agreements strengthen ties between the U.S. and its trade partners, and that lower tariffs reduce the cost of imports for U.S. consumers and the cost of U.S. exports for consumers abroad, increasing trade volume. Plus, reductions in non-tariff barriers facilitate U.S.-based foreign direct investment in other countries and vice versa, increasing the availability of capital in each country and in turn boosting growth through spending. Next, increased spending on the State Department increases its capacity to improve U.S. relations with foreign states. This occurs in two ways. A, there is more staff, meaning that there will be more preparation before meetings, more points of contact with foreign officials, subnational groups, and NGOs, and more researchers to improve policy outcomes for the U.S. and foreign countries. B, there is more money to spend to advance U.S. interests. More meetings of international institutions could be held with newfound resources for travel and venues, or even new U.S.-backed international institutions could be established to tackle emerging issues such as low global interest rates, artificial intelligence, and cyber warfare. The first impact of closer ties between the U.S. and foreign countries is that the international order is strengthened. This is true because A, forming coalitions with foreign countries through better relationships means that international institutions can more effectively pass and implement policies. B, strong international consensuses on certain issues build over time because it is disadvantageous for a state to disagree on fringe issues with a strong diplomatic and trade partner. The second impact of closer ties is that there's a decreased likelihood of armed conflict. This is true because A, increased trade and investment between countries vastly increases the cost of conflict and that it could spark an economic crisis in either country. Plus, B, countries with which the U.S. has good relations lack an incentive to attack the U.S., and the U.S. similarly lacks the incentive to attack them in order to gain concessions because both sides can use effective diplomatic channels. Our second argument is that decreasing U.S. military spending is good. First, decreasing U.S. military spending improves global stability by limiting the military's ability to topple regimes. The U.S. military topples regimes in numerous ways. The military frequently deploys troops, naval forces, and aircraft to directly confront a regime's military forces, as occurred in Afghanistan, Iraq, and Libya. The military also supports rebels seeking to overthrow regimes either indirectly via military bases, enabling the provision of weapons, training, and surveillance, or directly through the deployment of special operations forces from the CIA, as occurred in Chile, Guatemala, and Iran. Furthermore, the military supports foreign countries in their efforts to overthrow neighboring regimes through refueling of aircraft, surveillance assistance, and sale of weapons, as occurred in the Congo and is ongoing in Yemen. Toppling regimes foments instability in myriad ways. When a regime falls, a power vacuum remains, which incites a power struggle among existing political parties, wealthy oligarchs, and mobilized militias. This power struggle can lead to one dominant faction seizing power, followed by violent government repression of those that don't recognize the new regime. Alternatively, a power vacuum could lead to a civil war among parties of comparable power, resulting in mass casualties in a failed state. Either scenario produces a years-long conflict, destroying a country's economy and destabilizing an entire region through refugee flows and spillover violence. Second, decreasing U.S. military spending improves global stability by curtailing the military's capacity to occupy territory. The U.S. military occupies territory on land using troops, military vehicles, and weapon systems, and occupies territories at sea using battleships and aircraft carriers. Occupying both territory on land and at sea increases instability because neighboring countries perceive a significant likelihood of U.S. intervention, incentivizing military buildups while increasing the chances of a miscalculation that the U.S. plans to invade, causing an unnecessary conflict. Occupying land uniquely exacerbates instability because populations in the area mobilize against the occupying force that they perceive as imperialist, generating insurgencies and terrorism as occurred with al-Shabaab in Somalia. Occupying seas uniquely worsens stability because the U.S. controls economically important shipping lanes, making countries perceive that the U.S. could plunge a region into economic crisis at will, leading to the militarization of disputed waters, such as in the South China Sea. Next, and this is important, cutting military spending in half prevents the military from undermining global stability. The military can afford, at most, half as many troops, weapons, and vehicles, half as much surveillance equipment, and half as much energy to supply each of these efforts. So half of its capacity to topple regimes and occupy territory is gone. In addition, yeah, what's up?
What percentage of U.S. military is currently deployed?
I don't know the exact percentage. I would say that there are tens of thousands of troops deployed across the world. We probably have hundreds of thousands on reserve at home. Finally, decreasing military spending, in addition, decreasing military spending necessarily causes the U.S. to withdraw entirely from many such efforts because these efforts are sustained by a single expensive aircraft carrier, drone base, or group of special operations forces. Our final argument is that the military spending has certain unique costs. One such cost is A, American lives lost. It's an inherent cost of military spending because the risks entailed in military deployments, ranging from misfiring, insecure geographies covered in landmines, and snipers. There's never been a war without casualties. Additionally, the U.S. military incurs B, costs for the rest of the world. The military kills hundreds of civilians every month in foreign countries, and with ongoing interventions in Latin America, North Africa, and the Middle East. Even if the military tries to kill insurgents, civilian casualties are inevitable because of imprecise weaponry. We say you should vote go.
I would like to thank the Prime Minister for his eloquent remarks, and I would like to invite up the leader of opposition to receive the second consecutive speech, not to exceed 8 minutes with 30 seconds as granted.
Cool. I'm super happy to be here. Thanks for a great tournament so far, Danny.
You're welcome.
Thanks for a great case, guys, and thanks everyone at Moody for helping to run this. All right. Ready? Okay. 3 points in the off case. First, let's talk about the need for a strong force and for significant military spending. We think there are three distinct reasons why the U.S. needs to have a strong military force and why this military spending significantly weakens that. First, let's talk about how countries interact with the US through military grants. We'd argue that a big chunk of why the US is so influential globally is because of its ability to project power and because of its military bases overseas. We argue that when they make this cut, the type of things that go first are not programs at home, but they're the US bases in Germany, in Bahrain, in Saudi Arabia, and these sorts of places. We think then when the US has less ability to project power in these regions, in the Middle East, in Europe, et cetera, that countries are less incentive to engage with us. A good chunk of the reason why these countries are our allies, specifically Bahrain, is because of a US military base there, because the US Fifth Fleet is based in Bahrain. So when we lose these military bases around the world, we lose our influence in these countries. What happens then? We argue that there's two effects there. First of all, there's a power vacuum that happens there, where these regions become less and less stable as there isn't a stabilizing force in there, i.e. the US military base. The US military bases in Kuwait, for example, are a good chunk of the reason why the countries haven't tried to invade it recently. We argue then that when the US government pulls out of these regions, that regional wars become more likely. But secondly, perhaps more importantly, is that countries try to avoid this power vacuum, move to other global powers. What does that mean? That means illiberal regimes like Russia and China are the ones that are able to come in and dictate how these regimes work. We argue that at the end of the day, these countries are going to be allied and aligned with either the US, Russia, China, or some other similar global power. And we prefer the liberal democracy that is able to bring ideals of human rights into these nations than Russia or China. We think when Russia or China come into these places, then the values they impose and these sort of things they ask for are for the leaders to become despots or to impose these backwards economic policies. We tell you that this is necessarily worse for these people. We prefer the US as the hegemon in these regions. Second, under this, let's talk about how this army is actually functioning, not just the US's, but it's also for pretty much the European army too. When we look at NATO, where only 5 countries are meeting the 2% of GDP required or recommended spending on their military. What that means then is most of Europe is left largely defenseless without the US protection, without the US suddenly dramatically cutting back. The US has as much military budget as the rest of Europe combined essentially, and the US has as many soldiers deployed in Europe as most European countries do. What happens then is that you see an increase in wars on the eastern front of Europe. Recognize that while Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine, the only reason he hasn't done similar things to Latvia and Estonia, which also have significant Russian ethnic minorities that live in the east of the country along the Russian border, the main reason that these sorts of activities haven't taken place yet is because of the NATO umbrella. It's because of the US guaranteeing stability and saying that if Russia attacks, we will fight back. But when the US pulls out of Europe, when it becomes isolationist, when it doesn't look abroad, when it only looks abroad in a way of saying, no, Russia, please don't do that, but we won't stop you if you do, then these current activities become more and more likely. We argue that these wars with US allies become more likely. And third, let's talk about global stability. We argue that it's broadly a good thing to have a country that when the UN says, this is a problem, you can go in and do it, make an intervention, to have a country willing to do that. We argue then that when, for example, the Libyan intervention happened, where the UN sanctioned a peacekeeping force to establish a no-fly zone over Libya, that it was a good thing that the US was able to project this force because without it this would not have happened. When the US is able to go in under international mandates and prevent things like massacres in Benghazi that would have occurred had the Libyan army successfully retaken the eastern city, had to prevent things like Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait when he had already gassed a large portion of his population, when there is a global force that is able to move in at short notice, when the UN sanctions it, we think this is a positive thing for the world and a better thing for the world and the human rights overall. Secondly, let's talk about the State Department. So, 2 points under this. Firstly, we would argue the State Department simply won't use this budget. The reality of the State Department today is that Rex Tillerson is literally leaving money on the table. Is literally saying, no, we do not want this money. We do not want this money to come in, and we're refusing to use these $60 million. When we add another tens of millions, hundreds of billions of dollars to it, this similar reaction is going to occur. The reality is that when Republicans come into power, they cut the State Department every time, and the way they do this is by refusing to use the budget that is already allocated to it. What we think happens there is that this isn't an effective use of this money. We think this is also, more broadly, if we look just simply beyond political divides, we argue that the last 5 Secretary of States in a row, this includes people like Hillary Clinton, have all had a cost-saving initiative within the department, have all established a cost-cutting force, each one larger than the one before. The reality is the State Department isn't starved for money. The State Department is viewed from the top, from the political level, as being full of bureaucratic waste. That's the way, even if it isn't the reality of it, that's the perception among politicians. What that means then, whenever there's a political change, the first thing to cut, the first money not used is at the State Department. So we don't think this money is put to as effective use when it's tied up in waste-cutting committees and these sorts of things, when the political figures won't use it for political reasons. We don't think that's an effective use of money. We prefer money be invested in some way than left on the table. Second on this, we're going to say it's not effective. The reality is diplomacy comes from the top anyway. As much as they can talk about some individual at the US consulate in Taipei talking to some Taiwanese counterpart, that doesn't set US policy with respect to Taiwan. That may make it easier for one company to do one activity when you've got an in-the-ground negotiation, but the reality is policy comes from the top. And it comes from the people who aren't affected by State Department budgets. It comes from the Secretary of State, from the President, from the Assistant and Deputy Secretaries, all these political appointees who will exist regardless of the status. What happens then, when you add to these budgets, that doesn't increase the amount of diplomacy that goes on, that just confuses it more, that muddles the waters, as more individual diplomats have their own individual agendas, their own individual beliefs, that engage with different levels with these people. That when there is less direction at the State Department, because suddenly you have this giant influx of money, and like no more direction at the top, no more senior people, what you get then is that people with conflicting views and conflicting beliefs all negotiating together and leading to a muddled version of US policy that doesn't establish any clear goals, makes it actually harder for you to conduct diplomacy abroad. We'd also argue on this institutional level with the UN and these sort of institutions that like the US just cuts its contributions to UN every second presidency. The sort of institutional spending, the sort of NGO spending isn't the way things work. This stuff is all politicized, right? George Bush cut UN spending. Donald Trump cuts any aid spending to agencies that engage in some sort of abortion stuff overseas. George Bush did the same, et cetera, et cetera. The reality is these are political tools for administrations to posture at home. They're not effective tools of foreign policy. This isn't how they are used. This isn't how they will be used even with more money. Third argument, very brief, let's talk about DARPA. It's a good thing that the US has this military research arm. That's probably what gets cut first when you cut sort of money out of it. That's where literally the internet came from. We think the sort of spillover from lots of investigations into drone technology is a good thing, is positive economically and helps the world. But also more specifically on a military context, we argue that when DARPA is currently taking activities to look at more types of drone warfare, in other words, more warfare that doesn't actually hurt people and that leads to less and less casualties, we prefer research be done. We prefer warfare move forward and have less civilian casualties than stay where it is, and that's the world they have when they cut the entire DARPA budget on their side of the house. Going on case. They say two points. All right, so first, how about the State Department? They say State Department is good because you get less miscalculations. We argue miscalculations don't happen to the same extent, and you get more of them when there are more diplomats interfacing with a less clear mission. That's what occurs on their side of the house. They say that you get trade and closer relations. We argue that the trade relations, again, are dictated from the top, and we're already pretty good at it, right? The US State Department is fairly effective in the status quo, something they don't really grapple with. There aren't massive miscalculations. There aren't accidental nukes being fired if we thought someone was nuking us. This sort of thing doesn't happen. Similarly, trade is at its most open level in the last basically ever, right? Where the US State Department is fairly effective in doing its job, even if some people within the department believe it has too small a budget. Talk about institutions, but we'd argue that the US doesn't take these places seriously. The US is like one of the only major countries not to defend the Treaty of Rome, not to member of the International Criminal Court, because it doesn't recognize jurisdiction of international institutions. It doesn't take them seriously. It's not going to devote much of the money to this, even if it does so in the short term under their allocation. Second thing, less military things is good. So look, what will the US do when it has less military money? It's not going to intervene less. It's going to intervene worse. It means when it does intervene, it's going to the political incentives for the top, for the people who decide when to intervene or not, don't change, right? So it means interventions happen anyway, but instead of being overwhelming force, in other words, ending the war immediately, i.e. the Iraq war lasting basically 10 days into an occupation, you get a smaller occupation force that's to fight for longer and lead to more casualties on the ground. Or even worse, you get CIA-type interventions. What does that mean? That means either drone strikes, which have massive collateral damage, more so than boots on the ground, or it means you had sort of coups and instability, right? Recognize that CIA has committed these coups around the world. That's part of the CIA budget, not the military budget. When CIA does this, what you get then, instead of an Iraq war, which was relatively quick and then a sort of a prolonged but low-level insurgency, you get more of the Syrian conflict, because the CIA intervenes, creates internal conflict. The Russians and the Chinese intervene back because it's all covert. There's nothing to stop them from doing so. Whereas when the US has boots on the ground, they can't intervene back. Therefore, you get more of these covert internal conflicts that go on longer and longer and cost more and more lives. When the US intervenes, yeah, sure, it sucks in the short term, but the reality is the US intervening is what leads to the most stability in the long term when it is able to eliminate enemy combatants quickly and effectively. That does that better on their side of the house. So they have a unique cost. They say there's casualties. We say that, again, this is worse without this when you get smaller US interventions, but still US interventions. You get more casualties, especially of US soldiers, but also of everyone around, because the US is forced to use things like bombers and drones rather than just using boots on the ground. Leads to more civilian casualties, more American casualties. We are very, very proud to oppose.
Thank the Leader of Opposition for his eloquent remarks, and I would like to call upon the Member of Government to deliver the third and second speech. New arguments are allowed. Speech will be no longer than 8 minutes or 30 seconds.
Okay, just let me pull my timer up and get these papers all set. So hopefully this will make some kind of sense to everybody. Okay. Too many papers. Sorry. Okay. Is everyone ready? Okay, starting time now. Thanks everybody for being here. We're really excited to be at this tournament and be in the quarterfinal round. Thanks everybody for judging, opponents. Okay, with that, let's go straight down the case. So on their off case, they say their first thing, and this is like their most point, the rest doesn't really weigh. They tell you, so this is their only shot at offense, recognize that. They tell you that there's a need for a strong military because like the programs abroad will go first. So they tell you that there will be a power vacuum, right? We tell you that Russia and China lack the capacity to fill the power vacuum they tell you will happen, because, and this is because like there will be fewer aircraft carriers and you can't replace the Fifth Fleet. Second response to this is the US can stay in critical areas. Recognize that we have the ability to be like have troops deployed in places we don't need them right now, right? So if it is critical for us to be in a place, we can just send our troops there, right? And like also our military budget is 10 times the size of any other state, as we told you in the construction, right? So we have the resources to do tons of things that we're not already doing. Think about how much one aircraft carrier costs, right? So even if we like stop building some aircraft carriers, that doesn't mean we can't deploy troops to these critical regions. There's no reason to believe that the military would like really, really poorly make these decisions about where to do this spending, right? They're assuming a worst case scenario in which like we really unstrategically deploy our things and like don't do anything intelligently. So second, they tell you that like NATO and Europe will be worse off. We tell you that NATO expansion prompts the Ukrainian territory, and that diplomacy solves this better, right? They say like Europe's going to be defenseless without American troops there. One, like it's just not the case that like European powers are exceptionally weak or don't have any armies of themselves. We think that like all economically like strong countries already like are hegemons, particularly European ones, and like have lots of influence they can exert in the status quo. But further, we think that diplomacy always solves these issues better because we don't breed conflict and cost people lives in the process of doing it. Like I already told you, we also won't totally pull out. There's no reason to believe that we will have no troops abroad. All they tell you is that like foreign deployment will go first, but they don't give you any warrant for that. They just say like, you'd cut stuff, so probably this one. We give you reasons as to why you wouldn't do that. We won't remove troops from critical areas because we have an extreme excess right now, so even cutting 50% might mean that we cut programs like DARPA that are very expensive. I'll tell you why we don't think like that we have to do that, but even if you do, we don't think that we're going to cut in the most critical areas. There's no reason to believe that, and they don't give you one. Further, like even if you believe that we will fully pull out of all these areas, there's still the threat of the US military. Recognize that one of the biggest factors of foreign policy in the modern world is like checking against the threat, right? So the US will invade if there's a conflict. Like we will still have a military and do stuff, and it will still be one of the strongest militaries in the world, if not the strongest. So that doesn't change. Like even if Russia's like, well, that if we invade, the troops won't be there tomorrow, they'll be there the next day, right? So like the incentive structure doesn't really change that much. They tell you that like the US military needs to be there to like prevent massacres and things like that. We think again, you can still do this. Things that are like particularly relevant to our principles are the things that we will do most because you can sell them politically. Further, we think that like decreased spending is bad. So if they tell you that decreased spending is bad because like you're not committed to like preserving our values abroad, that's kind of the implicit argument that they're telling you, right? So we turn this because we think that diplomacy is always better at demonstrating our values because you actively state them, right? A military invasion is certainly less clear than us saying, we would like you to do X. Here are some incentives, particularly like 3 economic ones, where maybe like we'll do this type of trade agreement with you if you want this. It is easier to like state your values and say we are doing this because we care about democracy. That's always more clear. Second, we think that the military is bad at doing these values because they demonstrate aggression and use of force, which is principally undemocratic because it forces people to do what you want. And also, further, recognize that the majority of these human rights crises have to do with extremism, and anytime the US military is involved, extremism is further fomented. So their second point is that we won't use it because of Rex Tillerson. This is just silly, right? It is modeled that like we're going to use it proportionally, right? And it's going to go all projects. So first we modeled it that it goes into all these projects. Our second response is that project directors are incentivized to get more money to do a better job on their project. Rex Tillerson can't oversee everything, and he's certainly not going to say, State Department, don't do any of my interests. Like the Trump administration, even if they don't like the State Department, still has foreign policy interests that they would like to pursue, and they can do that better on our side of the house. But even if you don't buy any of that, Rex Tillerson won't be the Secretary of State forever, and as they wanted to model, we're not saying only do this for like this year. Further than that, we think that like even if just the like bureaucracy is better off, they'll do a better job at the tasks they're doing in either world, right? So if they're doing research, if they're prepping for cases that they're going to do abroad, if they're like researching their opponents or whatnot, they necessarily do that better because they have more resources. And they say like diplomacy comes from the top, so you're going to be more confused. We think that like having ties to people as we tell you on the case and they don't respond to means the bureaucracy has power, right? And so if you work with like your same level person in another country, you're going to not want to do things that will kill them, right? And you're going to understand their interests better, and you're going to do your job better. Further, we think that, as we've seen with many of the things about the deep state in, our modern U.S. politics, is that the bureaucracy has power and can influence these things. Further, policy experts can influence the Trump administration, people that don't know what they're talking about. We see this in lots of cases. Second, we think that you can do institutional spending to do anti-terror things. They say, Republicans don't want to, support institutions because of them to, abortions, right? So even if you're against that, there are still positive foreign policy institutions that we can invest in, like anti-terror things that Republicans would be on board with. Their last thing that they, could in some world get offense on is they say, DARPA's good and it'll get cut. We think that the production of tools for cyber warfare foments a more unstable world that's, look to the existence of, Russia hacking our elections. We think that a world in which that goes on is worse. So they tell you, so let's go on case. Our first point is exceptionally dense. They respond to almost nothing in it. Sorry, I have a lot to get through. They tell you, miscalculation doesn't happen. It's good enough. Kevin tells you in the construct, which they accept that all experts that aren't Rex Tillerson recognize he is not a relevant expert, say that it is not good enough. Recognize further that miscalculation is a huge risk in some of our most important areas, like the South China Sea. We are very worried about a miscalculation leading to something there. They say, we don't take institutions seriously. They just say that. They don't give you a reason. So what do they drop on this point? Kevin tells you that high-level staff will form familiarity and learn each other's negotiation styles and core interests, which means our communication is better, and this mitigates miscalc. Even if you think miscalc is a small risk, it's a small chance of happening, it's still a huge problem if there's a miscalculation that leads to a war, right? And that necessarily happens less on our side of the house. We tell you that staff-level officials can collaborate by prepping more, working during, and following up, and they work together more closely to develop better policy. We tell you that our economic diplomacy can be better by negotiating trade agreements with lower tariffs that increase trade volume and reducing non-tariff barriers like increasing foreign direct investment. We tell you that spending more makes all of this better because we can have more staff to prep, contact, and work with NGOs. They only tell you, Republicans don't like NGOs. That is not broadly true. They don't like some NGOs, and, it's probably true that during Republican administrations we won't work with those, but we can work with lots of other good ones that, have education to help people not, join terrorist organizations. We say that we'll spend more money on U.S. interests, like international meetings of institutions and new institutions on emerging issues. They will spend money on their interests. That is just silly to assert that they will be it's politically unpopular to spend all this money we have because it's politically popular, just wasting money and doing nothing. That is not true. That is not what's popular. That would be the swamp that their supporters are so upset about. We tell you that this strengthens the international order, and that's uniquely good because it reduces the risk of, lots of other problems going on. On to our second contention. We tell you that a reduction in military spending is good. They tell you our interventions will be worse because drone strikes and coups are bad. We think that happens less in a world where we prioritize diplomacy because we have other methods of getting the things we want done. And further, we model that you will do half as many of these because it will be cut proportionally. The drone budget being cut means there will be half as many drones. There will be half as many special ops teams that can do coups. Further, they tell you that we think the Iraq War is good because it was over so quickly. We think that that's just patently false. It wasn't over quickly enough and it shouldn't have happened to begin with. And recognize that they don't deal with any of the complexity on why we will decrease our ability to topple regimes, which leads to instability and a power vacuum. They also drop the entire second point about curtailing the ability to occupy, which leads to imperialism. Thank you. We're proud to propose.
I'd like to thank the member of government for our opening remarks, and I'll invite up the member of opposition to receive the final constructive speech of the round, not to exceed 8 minutes and 30 seconds.
Sweet.
Is that really good?
Uh-huh.
Awesome.
We think that the way this is going to be interpreted is that the U.S. is becoming isolationist. When there is this perception of U.S. troops being cut in half, U.S. military spending being cut in half, the idea that the United States has the ability to project its power and act as a deterrent is very much destroyed. What does this mean? This means the United States is no longer seen as a credible agent that is able to protect other countries through NATO, through other institutions, stuff like that. Let's go on to the arguments that she made in our off game. First of all, she said Russia and China lack the ability to actually fill those power vacuums vacuums, we just have fewer aircrafts. A couple of reasons why this is not true. First of all, it's happening in the status quo. Russia and China are actively filling the voids. For example, China's doing that in Africa. All these African countries having more cooperation and more dialogue with China because they see it as a hole that needs to be filled. The same thing with Russia and Eastern Europe and countries like Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, right? But second of all, right, we think that this kind of interaction is not worse. First of all, it limits our interest because we as the United States are not able to have negotiating power in that area. But also, it means that those interests, such as the communist government in China and like the authoritarian regime in China and Russia, are both kind of seen as their agenda being propelled. And we've seen that those create, like, the United States doesn't want that. We as a nation do not want that. She talks about how, we have like if it's critical, we're gonna send troops in either way. This is very, very important. It means two things, right? First of all, it means now that we have less troops, we are now no longer as effective as we used to be. Second, it means if we still send troops in on both worlds, that means they do not get any access to their impacts, where all they talk about is how US troops are bad and imperializing. Because if they still send in all of the troops on their side of the house, right, they still access all of those impacts. But let me tell you a few reasons why it's bad to cut those troops. First of all, we're not going to be able to preempt conflict. That's why we want to have those bases in Bahrain. That's why we have those bases in Turkey and Greece. Because it's not there to just promote anything. It's there to make sure that if a conflict arises, specifically internal ethnic conflicts, we're able to preempt them and solve them before they actually escalate. What they're advocating is, when we see a hotspot developing, then we can go and then we can send our troops in. We are preventing that. Remember that hotspots become inherently more violent, and our presence there, like they said, will only escalate things. Only by making sure that we prevent the conflict from actually starting can we actually solve things. But more importantly, right, remember what Andrew tells you about why it's important to have these bases in Bahrain and in Germany and in places and through NATO. It's because we have to step in when nobody else does. Remember it was a situation with like Ukraine, with other Eastern European nations. When countries don't want to step in because they don't see a reason to, NATO will not be effective if the United States is not there. The United States is not part of it, which means that we see another situation like Ukraine happening, right? She says that the NATO-Europe diplomacy solves better. There are local hegemons within Europe. Remember what Andrew tells you and what I just told you, that it's about stepping in when nobody else is going to. But more importantly, right, look how effective diplomacy was in the Ukraine situation, i.e. it wasn't at all. You have the annexation of a territory, you have thousands of people dying, and you still have a conflict that is still developing to this day. It isn't until we have specifically military interests that you see Russia stepping away and being, okay, we're not going to make this a full-scale conflict. Then she talks about how diplomacy doesn't cost lives. Diplomacy does cost lives when it decides to pursue a conflict, but more importantly, right, it's about stepping when nobody else does. She says that the USA can invade if there's a conflict. Remember the argument that I gave you, that it's about being a credible deterrent. The reason why nations don't engage in a conflict with us is because they know, I'll take your own case, it's because we know that it's because they know the United States is a powerful force that should not be fought with. We think that if the United States is no longer a credible deterrent, even if our army is still stronger, it can still destroy the other kind of enemies, it still leads to the ideology that, we can fight back, meaning we should try to. Which means that there's going to be a conflict, it escalates violence. She says that diplomacy is always better, and kind of this whole kind of issue about the State Department. A couple of arguments here that I don't think were addressed super well. She says that it's about project direction, we fiat that, we model that all the money is going to be going and being spent. What does Andrew tell you? He gives you kind of like he gives you an overarching argument about the way money is allocated in general, irregardless of how much money there is. He says that in the status quo, with a low budget, money is already left on the table with all people who are in charge of the State Department, irregardless of political party. That means Republicans, Democrats, everybody who's in charge of the State Department does not use all of the budget, which means this money that is going to be given and reallocated to the State Department is just going to be left. I'll take you on case, dude. It's going to be allocated. It's not going to be allocated. It's just going to be left on the table in the same way that it is in the status quo. But more importantly, what does Andrew tell you? He tells you that the status quo is that we reject international institutions already. It's not about engaging more with them. It's that we already don't agree with the legitimacy of the International Criminal Court. We do not abide by all the UN regulations. We don't. I'll take you on case. We do not engage with these institutions, which means that this more money, right? All it's gonna do is give a few more members in each consulate power to have their own opinions and talk to other individuals. This is what creates the miscommunication. This is what creates creates the incorrect dialogue flow when you have your massively increased network and you have other people who have different views and different points of view trying to project this is what America wants, right? Finally, I don't think they ever addressed our point about specific technology that's going to be cut. That's not going to be that how we're doing research to minimize civilian lives lost and civilian casualties. Those are going to be those research programs are going to be the first ones that are going to be cut. We want to maintain our current military, which means that we only minimize our ability to solve those conflicts effectively. Let's go on to Case. So she talks about how all experts say that the budget is not good enough, blah, 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 blah. Those experts are the ones who are going to be working in the State Department who want more money because they're going to be paid. We've seen that the leadership of those organizations actively do not want to pursue those opportunities. And we argue, I'm sorry, I'm also pressed for time, that we argue that we argue that is just not going to be actually given any money. She said the communication is better, and she goes on a huge rant about miscalculation. What happened with miscalculation? First of all, we deal with miscalculation by surveillance and by having we deal with miscalculation through surveillance, which is part of our military budget. Cutting that limits our ability to miscalculation. But more importantly, what is miscalculation? Miscalculation is about irrational actors within governments, and it's about mistakes that you cannot correct for. That's what miscalculation is. That's what accidental launch is. The only way to deal with that is not through a conversation with Kim Jong-il, right, or Kim Jong-un, but it's rather to have a preemptive technology and surveillance that is able to shoot down a missile in the case of miscalculation. She talks about strengthening international relation orders. I went on a rant about why they will not engage with international organizations, but then she talks about how there's going to be less war and we're going to prioritize diplomacy. I'm also pressed for time. I'm sorry. How we're going to prioritize diplomacy and how the Iraq war was not over quickly enough. A couple of arguments here. First of all, she never addresses, and it would be unfair for them to address, the CIA argument that Andrew gives you. That is very, very important. The CIA budget is not going to be changed. The CIA budget stays the same. It's still massive. What does this mean? This means when you cut all the things that she talks about, the United States federal government, instead of pursuing conflict, instead of pursuing military strategies to resolving conflicts, pursue strategies through the CIA, which means more Iran, more Latin America, more Chile, right? All of the same ways and mechanisms by which we have decided to solve situations. Go again. What happened in Iran? You had a revolution instigated by the CIA. The same thing happened in Chile, in Honduras, right? We have seen time and time again that when the CIA is involved, it's not an easy overcoming, and it's definitely what is going to be happening. It's not going to be a shift from military to diplomacy. It's going to be a shift from military to the CIA, which is inherently more violent and does worse things. Yes, we agree the Iraq War, right, was longer than it should have been, but it would have never been solved for in the first place if we only approached diplomatic means, and if there was no military budget, we would have done it through the CIA, which would have created a less stable situation. Thank you.
And to thank the member of opposition for his time of speech. In light of the leader of opposition to
Andrew, I'm going to quickly get some
deliver
water.
the first rebuttal speech.
Okay.
No new arguments may be made, however, no examples are allowed. It is up to the opposing team to call out any new arguments.
Sounds good. Danny's just running back from water. Or running to water?
Okay.
Running back. All right. Cool. Everyone ready? Berkeley, you ready?
Yes.
Cool. All right. 3 questions to boil down to this debate, or 2, I guess. First, let's look at the military cut, and let's look at the diplomatic spending separately, because I think they are broadly have separate impacts and are separate things, except that they tie them together in this debate. So, what are the effects of a military cut? We have a few things, right? The most important thing here is what Danny told you at the top of his speech, which is that the U.S. does this, it's viewed as isolationist, which means deterrence overseas is no longer credible. That even if you still have bases overseas, people don't think you're going to use them because they think what you're doing is turning inwards and not wanting to have as many armies overseas. We think what happens then is that the U.S. doesn't use the same effects, you don't get the same sort of deterrent effects, right? They talk about how you need diplomacy in these circumstances, but you get deterrence to better diplomacy. We think a better diplomatic outcome is one in which Russia doesn't invade Estonia rather than one in where Russia does invade the Ukraine. But when the U.S. doesn't have a deterrent umbrella, doesn't have military force, you get Russia invading the Ukraine, not Russia staying out of Estonia and Latvia. This is the effects they have, right? This is where they interact. This is where military spending is very important, is to prevent conflicts overseas. What happens, right, and the only way to prevent conflicts overseas is through power vacuum, right? I set up in my speech that it's either going to be a power vacuum or Russia and China step in. Emma told us, well, no, Russia and China can't do it. So we assume what they're saying then is it's going to be a power vacuum. And great. That's pretty bad, right? We prefer not to have power vacuums in Africa, in the Middle East, in South America. We think while we can keep bases in some hotspots, that's implicitly a concession that we will intervene if these hotspots turn really hot, right? If they don't want us to intervene in these circumstances, then why do they want us keeping bases near the potential conflicts? We think there's still some intervention on their side of the house. So which intervention looks worse? What are the interventions that happen, right? We tell you that they tell us they get less interventions, a proportional cut. We tell you what happens isn't that there are less interventions, the interventions change. Instead of having half as many interventions, when the US military does intervene, you just have half as many soldiers in that intervention, or half as many fighters, actually half as many bombers. And what does that mean? That leads to a more prolonged conflict. That leads to the US not winning as quickly. The US, sure, won kind of slowly in Iraq, but would have won a hell of a lot slower if it had 1/3 as many troops on the ground. That's the sort of circumstance that they're setting up, not a world in which the US never goes into Iraq in the first place. Because political reasons mean the US is always going to want to do these sorts of things, always going to want to take these steps overseas. They're also setting up a world in which you get CIA interventions. I told you these are explicitly bad in my speech. They just all they said was, oh, that budget gets cut too. That's not how that works, right? They copy out a military budget cut, not CIA budget cut. CIA oversees the drone programs in Pakistan and Yemen, and CIA oversees these coups overseas. So what happens then? Remember, you get more of these drone strikes, which always have more collateral damage than soldiers who can see who they're shooting at. And secondly, and perhaps more importantly, you get these coups instead. Why are the coups worse? I told you that coups lead to proxy wars. When the US has boots on the ground, Russia and China can't do anything about it. But when the US is trying to set up a friendly dictator, Russia and China try to set up their own friendly dictator, which leads to a prolonged conflict. And even worse, these are frequently ethnic conflicts. You see the situation in Syria, where there's an Alawite government fighting against Sunni rebels. You see the situation in Libya, where it was an Eastern Libyan against Western Libyan. These are the sort of conflicts you get when it's all purely internal conflicts, when you have countries choosing sides and furthering sectarian divides. That's where the real harm comes in. Also, recognizing in response to the Daniel's POI, Kevin told us, well, the majority of US troops are not deployed overseas right now. So we think the reality is that the US troops are not, continue to not, like, the majority of troops are not deployed right now. That means the US isn't close to its intervention capacity. The US intervention, even its capacity to intervene is cut in half. So the US is going to have the desire to intervene and the belief that it has the capacity, even if it doesn't fully. You just get worse intervention on this side of the house. They've never told us why the US won't intervene. They've just said that they caveated half as many interventions. No, they caveated half as much money for interventions, but that's still going to lead to the same number of interventions because of the arrogance of the US military. Also, under this quickly is DARPA. DARPA is a good thing. We like to have the internet. We prefer a world with the internet than without one. They cut programs that get technology like the internet. It's probably a harm. Second, diplomatic spending. Their main things are about institutions and connections at the bureaucrat level. And what is their main reason why you need this? Because experts say so. These experts are people in the State Department who, Emma tells us in her speech, people in the State Department want more money under their territory. This is in response to my point about Rex Tillerson. She tells us in her speech, people in the State Department want more money under their territory. That's why they're writing these articles as experts saying they need more money, right? It's because of these same reasons. The reality is connections at the bureaucrat level aren't an improvement. They lead to more of this miscommunication. When the US has 4 different people engaging with, or 20 different people engaging with the Taiwanese government at different levels, then telling them contradictory things, that's when miscommunication happens. When it's a clear message that comes from the top, there is no miscommunication. When the US is able to spy on these countries, there is no miscommunication. Let's look at institutions, but the reality is the US doesn't respect international institutions, doesn't follow them, won't give dramatically more money to them, even if it does in the short term, right? The US isn't a member of the International Criminal Court, the only developed country not to be. The US pulls out of UNESCO when it votes against Israel. These are the types of actions the US takes. They view institutions as ways to further political ends, not ways to improve the world. And so even if the US participates more in them, then we participate more in them as ways to get political ends, not ways to improve the world. They get the worst world when they have less security, less diplomacy. Very proud to oppose.
Thank you, Leader of Opposition, for your comments, and I will call the Honorable Prime Minister to deliver the last rebuttal speech of the round, not to exceed 5 minutes with 30-second grace period. No new arguments can be presented, however, new examples are welcome.
Okay. Is everyone ready? Let's begin. The debates become really confusing, so the points of crystallization as to why you're going to be voting for side government are only arguments that they haven't responded to at all. Zero response. So, the first of which is that the US military is no longer able to occupy territory. They talk a lot about the CIA, I'll respond to that later, but they don't respond at all to the arguments that we occupy land and sea. That increases instability because it means that other countries feel as though we are imminently going to attack. What does that mean? That means that we militarize sea lanes as well as cause insurgencies because people feel as though we're an imperialist force. But why do we get this argument? We say we cut half of our troops, we cut half of our weapons, we cut half of our vehicles. That means we are no longer able to occupy at minimum half as much territory, but we also give the argument that they don't respond to that says that certain occupations are propped up by one aircraft carrier or one drone base, and so we'll be withdrawing from far more than that. Why is this the most important argument in the round? We tell you that occupying territory fundamentally leads to conflict. It's what is leading to international conflict in the Middle East. It's what is leading to insurgencies in Al-Shabaab in Somalia, which is another example that we don't hear a response from. What's their best stuff on the military? They say that we lose our deterrent capacity. They knife their own argument, though, in the PMR when they say that since we have so many more troops at home, we have a huge capacity to intervene that doesn't go away. Also, we still have one of the largest militaries in the world, so we still have an enormous deterrent capacity. Furthermore, we still stay in critical areas, as Emma tells you, and so it's not as though we withdraw entirely. Also, they give this interpretation that we're being isolationist. No, we tell you that we're being engaged, and more so on a different front, on the diplomatic level, that we're going to engage much more so with a number of different countries. That means that every country's officials see us a lot more and in a lot more context. There's no argument that can be made that we're withdrawing from the international system insofar as we're going much further. So again, occupying territory is the most important argument with respect to the military. They say that the CIA is going to conduct more coups. So they could have asked a question about whether intelligence agencies are part of the military budget. We think that they are a subsidiary of DoD.
That's new.
It's not new, it's a clarification of the model. I made the extension in the MG that drones and coups are part of the military budget because they will be cut in half, and they are, in fact, part of the military budget.
Drones and coups get cut in half?
That's because they're part of the military.
Right,
if you didn't understand that, it's not a new argument, it's just clarity.
I didn't hear the argument that CIA is also getting cut until this speech, and that's why I think it's new.
Okay, I have on my flow that Emma said that drones and CIA were cut in half.
We'll take it under consideration.
Okay. Regardless, if you are persuaded by the argument about coups, you should be voting for us, because there are two ways in which the military, not the CIA, which has a much larger budget, conducts coups that they don't respond to. And we say that they overthrow regimes directly by opposing military forces, as occurred in Afghanistan and Iraq. Again, the MO concedes that the Iraq war was pretty bad. Also, we say that they overthrow regimes by aiding foreign countries, by refueling aircraft, as is ongoing in Yemen. So if you want to vote on the coups argument, the military has a greater capacity to do it. There are more arguments that we have that are unresponded to about how they do it, but I think it's less important than the occupying territory argument, especially because there's a lot of clash. They haven't responded to the occupying territories argument, however. The next argument that you should vote for Gov on is about diplomacy. So economic diplomacy is the cleanest argument here. We tell you that we negotiate trade agreements, which increases trade volume as well as foreign direct investment. Their only response is that trade is very open now. Yes, we should open it even more. We should increase trade volume, and that builds better ties with other countries. This gets around their argument about who's going to be doing the negotiating. We are negotiating trade agreements to decrease prices of goods for both countries. It's not a matter of there being many multiple officials, although there are multiple officials that contact every level in the status quo. Moreover, we tell you that we do this better because we have more money to advance U.S. interests. This is another unresponded to argument, that we can invest more in international institutions about diplomacy. Or about economics, rather. Their best case is that the U.S. is perceived as somewhat isolationist, and that we don't engage in the International Criminal Court. Sure, there are certain international institutions the U.S. doesn't like so much. That doesn't mean that it dislikes ones that are in its economic interest. Furthermore, even if the U.S. is perceived as isolationist by some other countries, the countries that we're doing bilateral talks with to increase economic growth do not perceive us as isolationists. They perceive us as a great trade partner. What this results in is a strengthening of the international order. That means that we have better relations on the whole with other countries, and we can actually get policies passed in international institutions. This outweighs their argument about NATO being weak, because NATO is just one small subset of the Western alliance. We say that the international order worldwide is much more strengthened by economic ties. Now I'm going to address the only other arguments you might be able to think about for their side. So they say that DARPA is a harm because we wouldn't have the internet. No, the internet is a thing now. We also make the argument that tools of cyber warfare are very harmful, like Russian intervention. That's a turn to that argument that they don't respond to. Next, they talk about how there will be a power vacuum because we lack U.S. deployment. Again, Emma tells you that we will remain in critical areas. So where we have an aircraft carrier, and we are the only ones that have an aircraft carrier, that power vacuum cannot be filled. Next, they say that we both intervene. That's not the case. We tell you that we have less than half intervention capacity. Yet, we will try to intervene in some instances where we deem it to be critical because we need to sell it to our political base. What does this mean? We say that it is still a better intervention because we avoid the costs of having an overwhelming military force. We tell you that that breeds insurgency by leading to massive civilian casualties, and that it makes other countries feel less secure. Because we occupy territory, because we strengthen economic ties, you should vote Gov.